the data points that we collect early on in the life cycle, as you can see, they find their way into many diverse data products as they travel downstream. So it is of the utmost importance for us to get the data right from the start. We have to get it defined, tagged, documented from the inception of the data during the survey design process as early as possible. And that metadata then stays with the data points as they move downstream, and it will facilitate all downstream operations upon the data. So the reason I focus upon the data collection process, that phase right there, number 5, is that out of all the phases there, the only one that you can't redo is the data collection, right? Everything else can be repeated or tried again in some way, or taken some more time on, but you can only collect the data once. If you go out and survey the same area with the same questions tomorrow as you did today, you'll get new data. So the data collection happens just once, and we have to get it right at that point. Otherwise, it affects everything downstream. So, like an analogy I often think of with the Census Bureau, and it's probably the same for most agencies, is just that it's like a manufacturing operation. And, as we know from manufacturing, small errors and fluctuations in the quality of the raw materials, they manifest in really difficult and expensive problems downstream that could have been avoided with tighter controls early on in the process. So just want to set the stage here that, that I focus on that data collection and with the hopes that it has that impact throughout the entire life cycle. The takeaway from this slide is just that the more work we do up front in defining our data correctly, the less effort has to be done downstream. And I'm sure the people downstream, I'm sure Zach, who will be talking next, would really appreciate it if we got it right from the start, because it's that much less they have to reverse engineer later on. Okay. So the decennial census, the 2020 census, is less than a year away from starting operations. And we've been doing a lot of work to ensure that the data collected across the nation will serve the intended purpose, which is stated here in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. But one thing we're also doing is keeping an eye on the fact that there are new purposes that are arising from the increased use and awareness of public data. And as we heard from Rebecca earlier on, the interest in public data is growing each year. So we have it as one of our goals to make our data as well documented for public consumption as possible. And to do that, we didn't want to recreate the wheel in things that we're doing, so we are relying heavily upon standards. And there was a great overview from Dan earlier on a lot of these. I'm just going to go through some of them that we use specifically for our metadata registry. So we looked at, how the private sector, the federal government, and even the international community have approached the complexity of dealing with not just metadata, but statistical metadata, which I think is its own class of metadata. And our starting point is the 11179 specification on metadata registries. Dan gave a good intro to it earlier on in an overview of it, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the specification, but if you're not, I feel like there's one picture in that specification that almost summarizes the entire 400-plus pages of the whole specification. And it's this one right here. It's in the document. I think it's in maybe the second section of it, and it just defines very simply what a data element is, and it's a combination of a concept and a representation. A concept is a property of a defined object class, and a representation is represented with a value domain. So you just have those two components, the data element concept and the value domain, combined together for a data element. And it sounds like something very simple, but I think there's many subtle things that come about because of that definition. One of the rules which I often mention from ISO 11179 is that you must first define a data element before naming it. So if you think about that, what it's saying then is that, if the definition is a good definition, it's concise, precise, non-circular, distinct, then the name will naturally follow from that definition. And I think that's something that gets overlooked often. People show up with lists of variables, long lists of variables with no definitions, and they're just names that they hope someone could figure out what the meaning is just by the name. With the ISO 11179 specifically stated that you must first define a data element before naming it. So it's a second rule, which descends from here, is that any two data elements with the same definition are the same data element. So that goes back to your definitions, where if you have a list, if you create a namespace for your operation or your organization of unique data elements, well, you've also then created a list of unique definitions. You won't have the same definition for two different data elements. According to the specification, they are defining the same data element. And then a third rule, which I think arises out of this, which is really important, is that if your value domain changes, you've created a new data element. And I think that gets overlooked sometimes, even within the Census Bureau. As we know, one of the roles of a producer of statistical information is to avoid a time series break, right? If you don't want to lose your ability to analyze that data over time by breaking the consistency of your variables. And even if it appears sometimes that there's no break because, the variable name might stay the same, or even the object and property stay the same, if the value domain changes, then the series has been broken. And, maybe it's been altered, or you could say it's been broken. I think an example of this with the Census Bureau, if you look at how the Census Bureau has asked the question of race and ethnicity over time, back to 1790, you'll see that, the object and the property in that case are still the same, the race and ethnicity of the person. However, the value domain is constantly changed, and it has so many different possible values over all of the 20-plus censuses that it's very difficult to do, a very clean, cohesive time series of those values. You have to generalize them, and that's something that we want to avoid. And I think the 11179 specification speaks towards doing that. Another standard, which is collaborative effort in the federal government, and we use this for naming, is NEAM, and NEAM is a 11179 implementation, and it's a registry of abstract data types that can be reused to build models and information exchanges. So it's a little different from some of the other standards in that it doesn't give you a model. Instead, it gives you the building blocks to make a model, and you can then build more complicated structures from the set of common data types that are used within NEAM. A little side piece over there is just a picture of the title to the NEAM naming and design rules, which is the NDR. We use those naming and design rules for the naming of our data elements. And as we do that, we extend, as you can see that picture, the wheel picture of NEAM. The center is called NEAM Core, which is data elements that relate to all domains. And then you have all these different subdomains under there. And so we extend the NEAM Core. We also extend some of the other domains as well, right? Like there's the maritime domain there. The census does conduct, an enumeration of the maritime vessels that are, holding U.S. persons in U.S. waters at that time. Likewise, there's the military operations domain. The census does an enumeration of the military during the decennial census. So we extend a lot of the existing elements there, and then we've added our own to fully support our own registry. And then looking internationally, we've looked towards UNECE, UN Economic Council for Europe, and which hosts, a bunch of different forums. And this is another one that Dan had mentioned earlier, the Generic Statistical Information Model. So we use this at a high level, and it is a high level, right? It's just a conceptual model. And the model is shown there in a little sidebar on the right part of the screen. Obviously, you can't read any of that, but it just shows that you can download it, from the website, and would encourage you to do so. But as was mentioned earlier, you really can't build right from there. You have to implement it, and it takes time to figure out how that conceptual model fits into your agency, into your own business model. So we've integrated that into a lot of the objects and properties that we use within our own registry. So we took those different building blocks and created our own metadata registry for the collection of the data, the collection process during the decennial census. And as you can see on the right, there's a whole bunch of sections that's broken out in object type. If you drill down under those, you go into the properties, and then you go into the actual elements, which all reuse existing representations or value domains where they're reusable. And so to give you some high-level information on how it's used, we have a system of systems that run the census, many different systems, some 50-plus systems that come together within the decennial enterprise, and they interface over 200 defined interfaces across all these different systems, passing data elements back and forth, different formats, different layouts, but we have standardized upon the elements. And the registry has about 2,500 data elements that reuse about 100 abstract data types. And that serves the purpose of the majority of these interfaces. There's still work we're continuing to do that we cover all of it, but we've been doing that process, continuing to refine and curate this over a series of operational tests. And we each year, starting in really 2015, we did a national content test. In 2016 and 2017, we did tests on the collection component of the census. And then in 2018, we are currently underway in doing an end-to-end test. So we've spent, those test cycles refining this registry and making sure that it can meet the needs for 2020 so that as 2020 gets here, there's really no surprises as to what to expect with any of these systems in what they're passing, what they're sending, and how to interpret it. Specifically, what is it that's being passed. So I want to go back to this slide because this is where we had started, and I always think it's a good place to leave off where we started. And to answer the question of, why are we doing all this? And as I stated before, that data collection operation is one of the few things, if any, that you cannot redo. In the full life cycle, you only get one chance at getting it right, and it's a lot of work to do this because, as we all know, metadata is very deceptively complicated work. Some organizations tend to treat it as routine technical documentation that can be handed off to anyone. But as we all know, it's very conceptually subtle and requires a lot of knowledge of the business operations, the IT enterprise, and perhaps even a strong grammatical understanding. I think it's a lot of different components that come into it to make the data elements be of value. And as you could also see here, one of our biggest stakeholders is ourselves, right? Each one of these phases of the collection depend upon the ones before it. And as I was mentioning earlier, as you go down towards the bottom into the dissemination, as we'll hear from Zach, they really depend upon us getting it right from the start. I think the last thing I just kind of wanted to point out with this slide is if you look at the first four phases, they're very different than the last four phases. The difference that I see is that the word data is not mentioned anywhere in those first four phases. And in the last four, it doesn't just mention data, it starts with data. It's all about the data. And that's really important to understand, I think, organizationally, because as the surveys are being designed, as the frames are being developed, the instruments are being developed, as all of this early stuff is taking place, it has to be done with ultimately the dissemination as the goal and the ability to work with the data downstream. Once the collection operations is done and the census has passed on April 1st, 2020, all of the work that goes into it essentially goes away, and all that remains is the data. And you could see that from this slide. Those last four phases just have the data to work with, and they depend upon it having been collected correctly, being tagged right from the start, so that all of these things that happen downstream can be facilitated, in some cases even fully automated. And at the very least, the steps in between can be validated. And I think that's really important. So it's where I want to leave off, just showing what we're doing during the collection period. And I feel that, this obligation to the quality of the data is part of the mandate, of what we do. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, you can always contact me directly, or I don't know if we could ask them now through the phone. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah. Where in the life cycle does the PRA submittal go?
Chris, one of the questions was, where in the life cycle does the PRA submissions go?
The PRA being the
Paperwork Reduction Act.
The Paperwork Reduction Act. I would say throughout the whole thing, but but I don't know specifically. There's so much that we're moving digitally out of paper forms that with this being the first internet-based census, I believe right now the current projection is that 60% of the country is expected to respond via the internet, and so that right there in that stage 5 of data collection, it will be a massive paper reduction if all the systems meet that goal.
I kind of disagree with the statement that Chris made that once you have the data, that's all that stuff before the data goes away. Right? It doesn't go away. All that stuff before the data is what you need to speak to the quality of the data.
Chris.
That stuff before the data, you can't calculate standard error.
Yes, I agree with that, but all you're left with to work with is the data itself. You could use information about the collection session or the operations to figure out the context of how the data was collected, but at some point, all of the data from the different modes of collection get bottled into one data set, and you lose the personality, I guess, of the collection, from whether it came in through the internet or whether it came in through a field enumeration. You lose that because you have to treat it as one data set. The tabulations are done upon all the data, not done by collection mode or anything. And so I do feel there's a point in the life cycle where the data itself becomes the only thing that then moves forward.
Go hand in hand. All of that stuff continues and is critical to the way we understand and explain the quality of our data to the public.
Sure. No, I agree that the intricacies of the collection process do show themselves in the quality of the data.
Marilyn?
Yeah, I want to follow up on the question about the PRA. If
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to respond only because I heard most of that. I didn't know if I caught the actual question there. I'm sorry. It's I think just a back to me being over the phone.
We also run through the same issue when you're going to submit for an information collection request through OMB to be able to put a survey in the field. You need to specify a lot of the data items. We would consider metadata, even the percentage of responses you expect to receive online versus paper, all that is part of the process. And I guess if I'm understanding correctly, a lot of that, we need to put that even a year or so, maybe even before we are even in the field or even before we have designed our survey form. So at least what we do at BA, we estimate, based on prior collection. Just because you have the same question and the question has the same response categories doesn't mean that data element is comparable either across time or across surveys. Asking a question on health insurance on an employment survey is very different than asking a question, the exact same question on the ACS versus asking the exact same question on a health survey. The context is different. The responses are going to be different. I mean, CPS and ACS could ask the exact same question, and you could give it the same data element name, but it's different. The frame is different. The context in which the surveys are conducted is different. The response mode is different. It's not the same thing. You just need to be careful about that.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like one of the themes of the conference is blended information products. And in order to blend, you do need to understand the intricacies of that data. It's like, I think of like a cake batter. It has to be smooth before you make it into a cake, or else the cake's not going to come out too good. You have to really understand each one of those data elements as you're trying to blend products. So there are small things like as I was mentioning with the race. There was a point in time when the enumerator would determine the race, and then I believe between 1950 and 1960, now it became a self-identification thing where the respondent identifies the race, and if you don't understand that part of that kind of small intricacy of that variable, you won't understand some of the fluctuations that occurred with counts there. So it does come down to truly understanding, right down to like those most minute details of the data in order to be able to blend them correctly.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, and I think we'll move on to our next speaker, Zach Whitman from U.S. Census Bureau, and he's Chief Data Officer in the Center for Enterprise Systems. Thank you.
Should I leave this guy?
Yeah.
We're supposed to sit down?
Sure.
Like right on top of it?